Celine Figard was born on May 23, 1976, in the small French town of Besançon, a quiet community located near the border with Switzerland. She grew up in a warm and close-knit household, raised by her parents alongside her two brothers and one sister. Her father worked as a farmer, and much of Celine's childhood was spent helping him out in the fields with her siblings. At school, she was outgoing, athletic, and well-liked, often participating in sports and surrounded by friends. When she was just 14 years old, her parents took her on a trip to nearby Britain, a journey that left a lasting impression on her. That visit sparked a dream in Celine. One day, she hoped to move to the UK. Motivated by this ambition, she chose a field of study that would allow her to pursue a career in hospitality, inspired in part by a cousin who worked as a hotel manager in England. After completing high school, Celine enrolled in a local university to study accounting. She continued visiting her cousin in the UK whenever she could, strengthening her ties to the country she longed to live in. One summer, her cousin helped her secure a job at a British hotel, where she worked temporarily before returning to France. By the end of 1995, 19-year-old Celine made plans to travel back to Britain for the Christmas holidays. At the time, public transportation in France was experiencing significant delays and disruptions due to strikes. So, her parents arranged for her to ride with a family friend, a truck driver who was delivering goods to England. He agreed to drop her off in Folkestone, from where she would make her way to Fordingbridge, the town where her cousin lived. On the 18th of December, Celine left home with plans to reach her cousin's hotel later that evening. Her parents expected a phone call from her once she arrived safely. But as the night dragged on and no call came, they began to worry. Celine didn't own a mobile phone, which meant her family could only wait and hope. Eventually, the phone rang, but it wasn't Celine. It was her cousin, calling to say that she had not arrived and asking if there had been a change in plans. Now deeply concerned, her parents contacted the French police. Authorities in France quickly reached out to British police, who immediately launched a missing persons investigation. Celine's parents traveled to England to assist with the search and told investigators about the family friend who had driven her to Folkestone. The driver was located and confirmed he had dropped Celine off as planned before continuing on his route. While at the truck stop, he recalled speaking with another French trucker who was heading toward Newbury, only about an hour from Fordingbridge. This second driver offered to take Celine closer to her cousin's home. British authorities tracked him down as well, and he told them he had dropped Celine off at a truck stop in Newbury. She had tried to call her cousin from a payphone, but for some reason wasn't able to get through. By then, it was around 4:30 p.m. The driver had suggested she take a train, but the nearest station was too far, and he couldn't take her since his delivery was in another direction. Wanting to help, he asked other drivers at the truck stop if anyone could give her a lift. The first driver he asked declined. He was resting before heading out. But a third driver stepped forward and said he was going to Salisbury, which was only a 30-minute drive from Fordingbridge. He told Celine she might be able to catch an 8 p.m. bus from there. With no better options, Celine accepted the ride. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Police tried to track down the third driver, but had little to go on. The second trucker who had handed her over couldn't remember the license plate, only that the vehicle was a white Mercedes truck. He gave a description of the man, about 35 years old, with short blonde hair and a beard. He also admitted something about the man seemed off. His mannerisms were strange, and it left him uneasy. Despite his gut feeling, he let Celine go with the driver because she had no other choice. Investigators grew increasingly suspicious that the third driver was involved in her disappearance. Using the witness description, they created a composite sketch and released it to the media. The first two truckers were cleared. Both had solid alibis and were in completely different locations during the critical hours. Then, detectives uncovered something alarming. The third driver had told Celine she could take a bus from Salisbury to Fordingbridge around 8 p.m., but that bus service didn't exist. Authorities intensified their search, distributing the composite sketch and Celine's story through British and French news outlets. The timing of her disappearance, just before Christmas, amplified public interest and concern. Adding to the fear, police were already investigating a possible serial killer in the region, connected to the deaths of several young women in recent years. Now they feared Celine might be his latest victim. A massive search effort was launched involving over 100 officers, helicopters, and even a plane scanning the countryside. The focus was on the suspected route the third trucker may have taken. But despite their efforts, no trace of Celine was found. The first week yielded nothing. Her family and the police made public appeals, asking anyone with information to come forward. Dozens of leads came in, but none led to answers. Then, on the morning of the 29th of December, a local man driving near Worcester pulled over to adjust his windshield wipers. While walking along the roadside, he noticed something unusual sticking out of the snow. Curious, he approached and realized, to his horror, that it was a human body. He rushed home and called the police. Officers responded quickly and confirmed it was the body of a young woman. At first, they weren't sure who she was. They initially suspected it could be a local woman who had vanished after leaving a nightclub, but that theory was soon ruled out. On the 30th of December, police officially confirmed the worst. The body was Celine Figard. Her cousin was brought in to make the heartbreaking identification, sparing her parents from that trauma. One disturbing detail quickly emerged. The spot where Celine's body was found was in the opposite direction of where she had been headed. That only solidified suspicion that the third truck driver had murdered her. None of her clothes or personal items were recovered at the scene. The autopsy revealed multiple bruises and injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, as well as signs of strangulation. There was also evidence of sexual assault, but no recoverable DNA was found. A chilling conclusion emerged. Her body had likely been left by the roadside just 24 hours before being discovered. That meant Celine had been missing for 11 days, raising the disturbing possibility that the killer had kept her alive or preserved her body. The second driver had mentioned that the third truck had a refrigeration unit, possibly an industrial freezer. This led police to suspect the killer had stored her body inside his truck while continuing to make deliveries. But there were still no solid leads on who he was. Then, her parents mentioned Celine had brought 2 bottles of rare French champagne as Christmas gifts. Those bottles, along with all her belongings, were missing. Since that particular champagne wasn't available in the UK, investigators hoped it might lead to a breakthrough. They released photos of the brand to the press, asking the public if anyone had seen or received bottles like them. Sadly, that effort led nowhere. With few leads, police took a bold step. Despite having no DNA from the suspect, they launched the UK's first mass DNA screening. They focused on drivers of Mercedes trucks with refrigerated units. Over a month, more than 5,000 truck drivers were tested. Most complied, but some refused, and those men were flagged for deeper investigation. Meanwhile, the case stayed in the headlines, and tips continued to pour in from both Britain and France. Still, none brought them closer to solving the case. That changed in mid-February, when one tip finally broke the silence. A man contacted police after recognizing the sketch. It looked like a co-worker, 36-year-old truck driver Stuart William Harling. Stuart drove a white Mercedes lorry with a refrigeration unit. Detectives began looking into him. Though his criminal history included only minor offenses, his refusal to provide a DNA sample immediately raised red flags. Eventually, under pressure, Stuart gave a sample. Detectives then secured a warrant to search his truck. Inside, they found traces of blood in the sleeping area. Testing confirmed it was Celine's blood. That alone was enough for an arrest. Police also searched Stuart's garage. There, they found Celine's personal belongings, the same ones she had with her when she vanished. They noticed something strange about Stuart's tachograph, the legal device used to record driving hours. The day Celine's body was dumped, he had tampered with the log to hide his movements. But he made a mistake. After dumping her body, he resumed driving without correcting the gap, leaving a suspicious hole in the record. During his first police interview, Stuart denied everything. He claimed he never met Celine. But when the second driver identified him in a lineup, Stuart changed his story. Now he admitted giving her a ride and claimed they had consensual sex. As for her belongings in his garage, he said she left them behind. Investigators didn't buy it. Then a new witness came forward. Someone had seen Stuart near a warehouse about 50 miles from where Celine's body was found. He was burning something near his truck. When police questioned him, he said he was trying to thaw frozen brakes. Officers searched the site and discovered Celine's underwear under a fence, bloodstained. Investigators now had a timeline. They believed Stewart had picked Celine up, driven her to a secluded location, assaulted her, and killed her. They believed he stored her body in the lower bunk of his cab for 10 days, all while continuing deliveries. Shockingly, he spent Christmas at home with his wife and children, while Celine's body was still in the truck. At some point, he bought a saw, an axe, and a shovel, likely planning to dismember her. But he abandoned that plan and left her body by the roadside. One final detail sealed the story. The day after Christmas, Stewart gave away the 2 rare bottles of French champagne. When questioned, he claimed he bought them from a different trucker, but police didn't believe him. They also noted that Stewart had always worn a beard until he suddenly shaved it off, right when the sketch hit the news. As for why Celine couldn't reach her cousin, she had written down the old UK area code. It had recently changed, and her call never went through. To friends, family, and co-workers, Stewart Harling had always seemed like a devoted husband and a quiet man. But now, the mask had shattered. At first, many people found it hard to believe Stewart Harling could be responsible. He came across as quiet, unassuming, even dependable. But as news outlets began reporting the damning evidence against him, public doubt began to crumble. People were forced to confront the terrifying reality of who Stewart truly was. His trial began in October of 1996. Despite the overwhelming evidence, blood traces, witness statements, Celine's belongings in his garage, Stewart stuck to his story. He continued to deny everything, insisting he was innocent. But the jury wasn't convinced. It didn't take them long to reach a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison, with a minimum term of 20 years before being eligible for parole. Not long after the sentencing, Stewart tried to challenge the outcome. He argued that the intense media coverage had influenced the jury, robbing him of a fair trial. But the Court of Appeal rejected that argument, standing by the original verdict. In 2006, a decade into his sentence, Stewart submitted another appeal for sentence review. That attempt also failed. Then, in 2016, the 20-year mark came, and with it, his first chance at parole. But his application was denied. The reason? Even after 2 decades behind bars, Stewart continued to deny any involvement in Celine's murder. He still refused to take responsibility. The parole board also expressed concern that he remained a potential threat to the public. As of now, Stewart Harling remains in prison, with no realistic chance of release in the near future. Meanwhile, it's important to note that Stewart was eventually ruled out in connection to the other murders that had raised alarm during Celine's disappearance. Those killings were later traced to another long-haul truck driver who was arrested in late 1997. Though he was formally charged with only 2 murders, authorities suspect he may be responsible for more unsolved cases across the region. As for Stewart Harling, investigators once feared Celine might not have been his only victim. But despite extensive efforts, no evidence has ever surfaced to link him to any other crimes. This case serves as a stark reminder of how the truth can be hidden in plain sight, and how justice, though delayed, will eventually find its way. A crime that would go unsolved for nearly 50 years shocked the peaceful academic community of Harvard on the 7th of January, 1969. Jane Britton, a bright and promising 23-year-old Harvard anthropology student, was found murdered in her apartment. Her brutal death left confusing clues and a community terrified. The case became national news, led to strange theories, and eventually went cold. But it was finally solved decades later, thanks to a persistent effort by a group of citizens seeking justice. Born in Boston, Massachusetts, on May 17, 1945, Jane was an exceptional young woman. Given that her father was a vice president at Radcliffe College and her mother was a medieval history scholar, it was not surprising that Jane had a strong interest in history from an early age. She had already made up her mind to study anthropology while in high school. Jane was an A student who also played the piano, painted, and enjoyed horseback riding in her free time. She graduated as valedictorian from her father's college, and then began pursuing her PhD in Harvard's anthropology graduate program. During her second year, she had the opportunity to work with a famous scholar on an archaeological dig in Iran, where she impressed everyone and made some significant discoveries. In her social life, Jane was well liked by her peers and had just started a relationship with another student named James. Jane failed to appear for her final exams on the morning of the 7th of January. Her boyfriend, James, found her absence strange and tried calling her repeatedly, but she never answered. No one, neither students nor professors, knew where she was. He walked to her apartment at 6 University Road after class, a trip that took about 15 minutes from campus. He knocked on her apartment door on her floor, but there was no reply. A mutual friend and next-door neighbor, Donald, came out and said he had not seen Jane since the previous night and that her apartment had been quiet. James knocked again several times, but still no one answered. His worry grew at this point. Knowing Jane's front door lock was broken, he tried the handle, and the door opened easily. Upon entering, he found the apartment to be freezing cold because the kitchen window was wide open, despite the winter weather. He then went into Jane's bedroom and saw her lying face down on the bed with her nightgown pulled up. Thinking she might be ill or asleep, he quickly went back out and asked Donald's wife to check on her. The expression on the woman's face when she came out of the room confirmed his fears, as she was too shocked to speak. James re-entered the bedroom, lifted a rug and coat that were covering Jane's face, and discovered she was dead. He immediately called the police, and it was instantly clear to the officers who arrived that a murder had occurred. Investigators were initially confused by the crime scene. According to the medical examiner's report, Jane had been sexually assaulted and repeatedly hit in the head with a heavy object, possibly a hammer or a rock. The attack was believed to have taken place around 1:30 a.m., shortly after she arrived home and roughly 10 hours before her body was found. Because nothing was stolen, robbery was ruled out as a potential motive. The lack of any signs of a struggle led detectives to think the killer may have surprised her in her sleep. This idea was supported by the fact that no neighbors reported hearing anything out of the ordinary. Detectives found little helpful evidence in the apartment. Crime scene experts discovered a few fingerprints that didn't belong to Jane's friends or neighbors, but were unable to match them to anyone in their databases. Police considered a few theories about how the killer entered the apartment. One theory was that the killer simply walked in through Jane's front door, as the lock had been broken for some time. Another possibility was that the killer used the fire escape, which was right outside her 4th-floor apartment, since her window locks were also unreliable. A child in the building remembered hearing noises on the fire escape that evening around 9 p.m., but Jane didn't arrive home until nearly 11:30 p.m. A different witness reported seeing a man running away from the building at about 1:30 a.m. This witness only recalled the man being about 6 feet tall with an average build, but this lead seemed more promising because the time of the sighting matched the estimated time of the murder. Nevertheless, based on both witness accounts, detectives started to theorize that the killer might have climbed the fire escape at 9 p.m. and waited for hours until Jane came home. Donald also provided an interesting detail. He had been in Jane's apartment earlier that evening to use her fridge, where he and his wife stored some groceries, and everything seemed normal. This suggested that the killer had not yet entered the apartment or had been waiting on the fire escape for her to come home. The day after the murder, the story had spread across the entire university and soon became a national headline. The police faced intense pressure to solve the case. A strange theory developed after investigators found a reddish powder on Jane's body and in her room that resembled ochre or iron oxide. A professor of Jane's explained that in some ancient cultures, particularly in Iran, where Jane had recently traveled, it was a ritual to sprinkle this type of powder over the dead. This prompted speculation that the killer was a fellow anthropology student with similar knowledge, and who may have even traveled to Iran with Jane. The lack of stolen items supported this theory, suggesting the motive was likely personal. Although police were not completely convinced, they couldn't disregard the theory. So they compiled a list of about 100 students and faculty with anthropology backgrounds and investigated each one, but it led to no breakthroughs. A new theory emerged later. What if Jane was the victim of a serial killer? Just 5 years earlier, another female student had been murdered in the same building, 2 floors below Jane's apartment. Although the infamous Boston Strangler was suspected at the time and even confessed to the crime, many people were doubtful. The Boston Strangler was in a secure psychiatric facility when Jane was murdered, so he could not have been the one responsible. With detectives still lacking solid leads, local newspapers began to publish theories and place blame on the university. Harvard had bought the building and started housing students there a few years before, but the building was in poor condition. The locks on most of the apartment doors and windows were broken. Newspapers started to criticize the university for forcing students to live in unsafe conditions. In the meantime, police continued their search for any useful information. They administered polygraph tests to Jane's boyfriend and neighbors, questioned other suspects, and even set up cameras at her funeral to record all attendees. Detectives managed to identify every person at the funeral, but none could be connected to the crime. Weeks went by, and they were no closer to solving the murder. This stalemate continued until the 6th of February, nearly 1 month after Jane's murder, when police found the body of a 50-year-old woman named Ada Bean. Ada's body was discovered in her apartment, located about a mile from Jane's Packett's. Similar to Jane, Ada was found face down in her bed, with her nightgown pulled up and her head covered by several blankets. She had also been hit in the head with a heavy object, suggesting she was attacked while sleeping. Local news outlets quickly highlighted the remarkable similarities between the two cases, but for some reason, police dismissed the idea that they were connected. Police stated that they did not see a link between the murders and did not believe the same killer was responsible. The public reacted to that statement with predictable doubt. Most students and locals were convinced a serial killer was on the loose and could attack again at any time. However, just like with Jane's case, investigators found no solid leads, and the second murder investigation also went cold. Jane's case had no new developments and was eventually filed away. Over the years, detectives would review the case file, but every attempt to find new information failed. The local police eventually gave the case to the state police, who began their own investigation but also came up empty-handed. In the late 1980s, with DNA analysis becoming a standard forensic tool, detectives decided to re-examine the physical evidence. They discovered a set of samples that had been collected from Jane's body. A lab successfully isolated a small trace of semen, likely from the killer, but it was not enough to create a full DNA profile. Years later, the samples were checked against the Federal Bureau of Investigation's new national DNA database, but no match was found. In 2006, they tried again with more advanced technology, hoping for a breakthrough, but they were unsuccessful. The case remained cold for several more years until a group of citizens, acting as amateur investigators, became interested. One member was a retired writer who, as a young reporter, had been assigned to cover Jane's murder on only his second day on the job. Decades later, he chose to re-examine the case with the goal of finally uncovering the truth and writing a book about it. The second person was a Harvard journalist who became deeply invested after learning that the murder had occurred so close to her campus. They were joined by a forum moderator who managed a website for unsolved crimes and was equally determined to solve the mystery. The group began investigating Jane's case and submitted numerous records requests to the police, but nearly all of them were denied. The limited documents they did receive were mainly old newspaper clippings with only basic information. This kind of secrecy was a standard practice in Massachusetts at the time. However, the group was not prepared to give up. They took their fight to an appeals court, arguing that being transparent had helped solve other old cases by involving more people and generating new leads. The court dismissed their petition, but they were not deterred. Over the next few years, they continued to file lawsuits against the district attorney's office. While each lawsuit was dismissed, the combined pressure they created had an impact. After years of being pushed, authorities finally agreed to reopen the case in 2017. Experts re-examined the biological evidence from the crime scene and were able to extract a somewhat stable DNA sample. When they searched the Federal Bureau of Investigation database with the new sample, they found a potential match to a man named Michael Sumter. The partial match wasn't strong enough to be used in court, and the sample was too degraded to provide a full DNA profile. Despite this, detectives started to investigate Sumter, hoping to find more concrete evidence. His DNA was in the system because he had a criminal record for 3 different sexual assaults. Police had previously solved 2 cold case murders from the 1970s in 2010 and 2012 by matching old DNA samples to Sumter's profile. All of his crimes were committed in Boston, close to Harvard. Investigators also found out that he was dating a woman who lived close to the university around the time of Jane's murder. Furthermore, his height and build matched the description of the man seen running from Jane's building. While all signs pointed to Sumter, there was a major obstacle. He had died of cancer in 2001, making it impossible to get a direct DNA sample. As a result, detectives looked for a close male relative and eventually found his brother, who was still alive. After some effort to locate him, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The results showed a match, though it was again not a perfect one. The degraded crime scene sample was the problem. It lacked the quality needed to create a full genetic profile. Despite this, the test was strong enough to eliminate all but 0.08% of the world's male population. Although that still leaves nearly 350,000 people, the fact that Sumter lived near the crime scene and had a history of similar assaults was more than enough to identify him as the killer. In 2018, nearly 50 years after the murder, police held a press conference to officially announce that the case was solved. Police believe that on the night of the murder, Michael Sumter followed Jane home and waited for her boyfriend to leave. He then climbed the fire escape, entered through the kitchen window, and attacked her with the intention to assault her. Detectives offered a simple explanation for why the DNA match wasn't made until 2017. While Sumter's DNA had been in the system for years, the sample from Jane's case was too degraded for earlier technology to even find a partial match. The two other murders linked to Sumter had full DNA profiles available, which made those matches easier to confirm. Police were never able to connect him to the murder of Ada Bean, the woman whose body was found a month after Jane's planks. The issue was a lack of usable DNA from that crime scene, so detectives couldn't be certain. However, because of the unsettling similarities, many people believe Sumter was also the killer in that case. The reddish powder found in Jane's room and on her body, which led to theories about ancient burial rituals, was most likely just pigment from her paint, according to police. Police found no evidence that the powder was connected to the murder. Jane's case was finally closed after almost 5 decades, largely thanks to a small group of citizens who refused to let her story be forgotten and pressured the police to re-examine the case.